Prichard Committee's annual meeting, Excellence and Equity in Education in a Changing World. With me tonight, I'm pleased to have Dr. George Wright, who is currently serving as the Interim Vice President of the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at the University of Kentucky. He's the Senior Advisor to President Eli Capilouto, a distinguished university research professor, and the former president of Prairie View A&M University in Texas. Dr. Wright, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. We also have with us, as we typically do, Kenya McFeeters, who will be interpreting our conversation this evening. Dr. Wright and I are going to talk about the call for racial equity and justice, and put our conversation today in the context of history and look forward to think about solutions. Dr. Wright has spent his many years as a university professor and administrator, so through the lens of education, but by discipline, he's a historian. So he's spent his career really looking at these issues deeply, and you'll get to hear more about that. So, Dr. Wright, I'd like to start us off tonight by reading the opening of an op-ed that ran in the Washington Post this week, actually, on September 28th. It's written by a fellow by the name of Rick Blake. He happens to be the uncle of Jacob Blake from Wisconsin. And Mr. Blake writes, the long history of racism and racial oppression in Kentucky had its latest chapter written when Breonna Taylor was shot and killed. The lack of direct charges in the grand jury indictment and choice by state and local officials not to pursue justice more aggressively don't diminish the fact that the police killed Taylor without cause. He goes on to say, but the dehumanization of Black lives isn't new. Kentucky has a long history of violence, massacres, and lynching of African Americans. And he goes on to describe in great detail, and he quotes quite a bit of your work. He quotes your book from 1996 called Racial Violence in Kentucky, and goes on to explore the issue today through the lens of history. So I'd like to open us up, Dr. Wright. This is weighing heavily on all of us, the grand jury proceedings in the Breonna Taylor case, how we pursue racial equity and justice, how we do it well. And in the midst of all of that thinking are emotions, deep emotions, deep concern. And so my question to start us off is, how are you feeling in the wake of that ruling? And what are you saying to students and adults seeking your counsel at this moment?
Okay. I find myself in a dual situation. First, as a citizen, as a human being, as a person who's concerned about the issues that occur in our society, from the moment I heard of what had happened going back to the spring when she was killed, and then how things have evolved, and then with George Floyd's death and things like that, I wondered what the determination would be at some point. And again, for myself, I kind of decided that, okay, I've seen things in the past where I had hoped it would turn out a certain way, but it had turned out another way. So I think I had prepared myself mentally for the way it turned out. And in fact, I think there were some clues that I saw. I thought the announcement of the civil settlement of $12 million to the family suggested to me that the officials wanted that out there in advance. But then, earlier in the week when they said they were taking some steps to prepare in case there were protests and worse in Louisville, that kind of gave me a sense that, okay, this decision might not be what many people would like for it to be. So I think for myself, I had made up my mind that this was how it was going to come down. But I'm in the position of being a university professor and administrator, and I'm teaching, a class this semester, a seminar on slavery in the Americas. And while that ends with slavery in the United States in 1865, slavery in Brazil in the 1880s, I knew very quickly that my students would see what's happening in the contemporary society and want to weigh in on that issue. So last Wednesday, in fact, my class meets from 3 to 5:30. So the decision had been announced before that. And so I was prepared for that. And what I then do, I try to not show to students, to others, my true feeling, because it's important for me to allow others to have their feeling. I really do believe that it's possible that I could say something that can sway someone. And I think it's more important for people to reach their own decisions about something. And so in my class last week, I said, I said the first day of class, I'm saying now that a classroom has to be a safe environment where we can discuss the issues that are relevant to this class, and that you have a right to say whatever view you want. Understand that not everyone may agree with your view. And as long as you don't say something that we all would agree is inappropriate about someone's race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, religion, and those type of things, you can say whatever you want. Well, I've been a professor since 1977, and I must say, I heard students express themselves in ways that I had not had in my class before. But I had said they had a right to do that, and that's what happened last Wednesday. And if anything, I would summarize it by saying that I have encountered many people who are discouraged, more discouraged than angry. Now, I don't know if discouragement leads to anger, or it could lead to apathy. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of people just don't believe that the system is fair, is what I believe I've seen people say consistently.
So like you, they may have been preparing themselves for the result that eventually came, and felt some level of resolve, resign, while at the same time, real discouragement that we need to fix things. There is something that needs to be fixed.
That's what I would think, that I've heard so many people say. And the Breonna Taylor case is just one example, one tragedy on top of other things that I have heard people say are problems. Even before 2020, I think there were enough instances of where people would say this illustrates that, let's say, I'll put it in this context, that Black people as a group don't receive justice at the hands of the legal system, at the hands of the police, in that sense. And I think 2020, this year, has only reinforced that view that was already there.
And hopefully more deeply held now, as younger people and others are really grappling with this moment in a way that maybe they weren't just a few years ago.
Well, what I have said, that there is something different this year, that I have seen more people want to talk about race, want to look back on things. And in that context, I say it's a good thing. I'm not exaggerating when I say that maybe because I've been a professor since 1977, and for many years, I taught a class each semester that had 500 students in it, of American history. So if you just do the math on that, you can see how I've taught a lot of students. Well, consistently over the years, former students would contact me. Let's say when Barack Obama was named president the first time, there were students from my classes that contacted me and said, we talked about whether or not that would ever happen in class, and so forth. Okay, well, this year, I've had more students to contact me, and I'm a generalize and say it's been a larger number of white male former students. And I have a very good relationship with any number of former students who are white males. In fact, some of them have been personal friends since then. But they've asked me, Do I believe that their accomplishments in life have not been real, that they have been aided by white privilege? And of course, I'm in no position to denigrate what people have accomplished in life. That I think it would be wrong for me to say that in every instance, oh, you only or have been successful because you were a white male, when I know the struggles that many of these individuals have had. But the fact that they raised the issue and that they said, was I missing something? Was there racism going on that I just was not exposed to? I think those have been good conversations. Here in Kentucky, even before I arrived, I read an article, I'd say, back, it was probably during the COVID time, from Rex Chapman, a former University of Kentucky basketball player. And he talked about growing up in Owensboro and that how he had some very good white friends who he interacted with and some very good black friends. And so he said there were occasions that he had been to parties with, let's say, the white kids. And let's say they're 16 or 17, and they're probably doing some things they should not have been doing. And Rex Chapman said, but the way they responded when the police came, they didn't run off because the policeman knew them, and the policeman would say to them, I'm gonna tell your daddy on you. You're gonna get in trouble for this. He said the black kids knew to run off because the police didn't know their fathers. The police were not giving them a break or anything. Mm-hmm. And so if you grow up and that's your experience, both groups of people might be correct in saying, no, this is how the police interact with you. And then another person says, no. Suppose you are of a group that when you're driving and you have a minor traffic violation, the police say to you, don't do that again. Mm-hmm. Suppose you have a minor traffic violation and the police give you a hard time. Which version of the police is true? Maybe both are in that sense. So it may mean that people can look at the world differently and both be sincere. How do you then get people to see the other side can be a real challenge.
And that's part of our conversation right now, certainly, is trying to understand that other side. In the wake of the death of George Floyd, we hosted a week-long series entitled Black Minds Matter, really focusing in on academic achievement gaps, attainment gaps, why those exist, and some other issues related to racial equity and justice. And a young man who is a member of the Prichard Committee, former student voice team member, and a student at Lindsey Wilson College from Louisville, he described the feeling that he would get as a young man driving if a policeman was behind him, and the fear that invoked in him, even if he wasn't doing anything wrong. But the fact of the matter is he was a young Black male driving and there was a policeman behind him. And so therefore he was fearful. And he described that in that setting. And I think it's so important for folks to hear those stories and know that the experience as a white person is not the same as the experience of a Black person when it comes to these issues, particularly with police.
Right. Well, one of the things I have long said in life, and I don't know if it will be conveyed to your audience tonight or if people are in a mood at all to laugh at something. But for much of my life, I have used humor to try to get through a rough subject or certain kinds of things. One of the things I've said is that I wish every white person could be Black for a week. And I'd say, oh, that may be too much, maybe a day or something like that. And here's what I mean, is that if you were a white person and you had to look through the world through the eyes of a Black person, that would not mean that everything you saw meant that the Black person was right and the others were wrong. No, but I actually think that you might get a different view of certain issues or certain understanding or a certain level of empathy. One of the best things that has happened to me in life is that I had to learn to look at the world through the eyes of, quote, others. To be successful in a predominantly white society, I think a Black person or anyone needs to understand certain things. It doesn't mean you always agree with. And through much of my education, I had to read documents and things that I think were difficult to stomach sometimes in the subject of race because of the perspective they were taking. But it helped me to understand this may be how whites or some segment of whites feel about Blacks. Can everyone white say that they tried to look at the world through the eyes of Black people? Can every man say that he's tried to look at the world through the eyes of women? Has everyone who's a member of a majority religious group tried to look at what it must be like to be in that same society and be a minority religious group, especially one that others may have stereotyped in some way? And that to me is what I think is part of it. If we could somehow do that. And then the other thing that I would say, for as long as I've been a professor, I've said the fact that we don't really sit down and talk seriously about race, honestly about race, understanding that if I slip up and don't use the word that you most use to describe Black people or white people or something, doesn't mean that I'm not committed. I think if you look at the whole context in which I speak, you can then decide whether I'm committed or not. But why can't we have a dialogue on race when there is no serious racial problem? It makes it easier than if a racial incident occurs, that you've already built that bridge that I think is so important to have a conversation with someone. So that's what I wish. I wish we could look at the world through the eyes of others. I wish we could talk in a way where I could express my view and not be labeled a certain way. And I do the same to other people, and that we truly listen and sometimes acknowledge that maybe they are right and I'm not. Being Black doesn't make me right. In that regard, doesn't make me wrong, but it sure doesn't make me right either.
Great point. Great points. I don't know, Dr. Wright. I mean, I've always thought that being a woman, though, makes me right.
Well, I noticed I didn't use I was raised by a woman, so I know that women are right. That's not an argument with me.
Oh, thank you. I want to remind our listeners that we are happy to take questions via the Facebook comments section. So if you have questions, comments that you would like me to ask or that you'd like to share with others who are listening, please type those into the comments, and my team will get those to me and I'll try to ask those questions. So, Dr. Wright, I want to kind of pull on a thread in the conversation we've been having and talk a little bit more about us having the conversations about race that we need to have and how we have them, or the importance of having them in the context of a deeper understanding of our history. Our history as Americans, as Kentuckians. And you've spent so much of your life studying and writing about these issues. You're looking from slavery to Uncle Tom, to the civil rights movement, to mass incarceration. Here we are with the growing rise of the Black Lives Matters movement. As you think about that arc of history, are there things that certainly there are things that discourage you and things that give you hope? So I guess share with us the importance of a deeper understanding of our history so that we can be empathetic to each other's lived experience, and what that means for this moment in time.
Okay. Ironically, I think it's my understanding of history that gives me a sense of encouragement, and yet leads to my not being surprised that there's a continuation of some issues. And here's an example of what I mean. That almost any example that we use today, the tragic death of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, and so forth, I can show you examples in history that are much worse than those in that sense. And so on the one hand, while I am completely sympathetic now, I just say people have no understanding of how things really were. For instance, I don't know if you've seen this movie, Just Mercy,
Yes.
that talked about where it's based on a true story, where he talks about where it's centered around these probably 6 people on death row that he is the lawyer for. Okay. Well, what I thought about was that after the Civil War, with the sham ways that Blacks were arrested, do you know how many other people were executed? But even more than that, think of the tens of thousands of people who were arrested on minor charges and told plead guilty to 10 years, don't plead guilty to 50. You may face. And so how many people are like that? So as horrified as you might be about those 6, you have no real clue on what it's been like. So in a real sense, and here's the irony, I can then almost say, but we've made progress given how bad things used to be. For other people, they're stuck with just how bad things are now. So history, on the one hand, shows me that there has been change, but yet on the other hand, history shows me there's been a certain amount of continuity to the lack of justice for everyone. But what I wish people could see is that where do we really start? And what's really fascinating is that when we talk about our founding fathers, when we talk about what this country was built on, I think it's fair to say these men promoted slavery and they promoted freedom. They promoted both of them. Freedom and slavery grew together. Then after the Civil War, you have more rights, but discrimination growing together in that regard. And so people will want to say, no, our country was built on freedom. Well, I could say our country was built on slavery. I can give you enough from the Constitution and things like that. I think people need to understand just how complex it is. Yet after saying all this, and I often say to my students, if you follow me from day one to the end, you might say, well, you just contradicted yourself. I can still show you how Black progress, to use one group, has occurred in spite of all of that. I wouldn't be sitting here with you right now if nothing had ever changed. I am a product of tremendous change in American society. So if one wants to have hope, it's people like me and countless others who can show you that. The challenge is, how do we make sure that other people have those same opportunities in that sense? So in fact, I often say I came along at the right time. I'm not so sure the world is as open to young people as it was for me in that sense.
So you feel there has been some regression, maybe, since the civil rights movement, or we get better in one area and worse in another area, that there are trade-offs on our path of progress?
Well, I tell you what, one of the, I mentioned I'm a research professor now, and while I'm writing a book on a very fascinating man, who was a lawyer, among other things, a person who was assassinated in the year 1900. That's very good. And I'm also trying to do a comparative study of race relations. I'm writing a book about my own life. Please don't laugh. But I tell folk that it just so happened that I was born in 1950. You say, okay, well, if you were born in 1950, it meant that you were 18 in 1968. And so I'm born into a racially segregated society that almost immediately started having cracks in the walls of segregation. And in 1968, um, there are institutions like the University of Kentucky that decided that even though their doors legally had been open to people like me for almost 20 years by then, they had not done enough to really bring people like me in. And so you see, there was an acknowledgement that they needed the largest society to do more. And whether some Black people like me want to admit it fully or not, there were some special things done that really gave us an opportunity. In my case, April the 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. His assassination led to UK and about 20 other schools operating separately that they said they wanted to do something in honor of Martin Luther King. That almost, I'd say within a month of his death, UK informed the Lexington 4 public high schools at that time that they were going to have a special summer program for Blacks who had just graduated that spring. Now, I understand if I jump ahead today, they would say underrepresented groups and so forth, and I would appreciate that. But then they said, if you were a young Black person graduating from high school, if you come over to UK and take simulated college classes, do it the whole summer, we will give you a Martin Luther King scholarship at least for one semester, as long as you maintain the B average. Now, I tell you what, I couldn't believe that. I thought there was a trick to that. I mean, that just doesn't seem right to me, even at that time. But since I had done nothing in high school, and that was nobody's fault but mine, I go over there and I said, I'm going to really find this out. And lo and behold, they looked at my grades and said, you know what, you really don't belong here. We really don't think we had you in mind. But since we said you could come, well, guess what? 9 years later, I had a PhD from Duke University. And I'm now 70 and new opportunities still come my way.
And you're looking for those, no doubt.
And that program, those opportunities did it. I don't believe those same opportunities are there. I think society would now say, we've paid, if there was a debt owed Black America, we've paid that debt in that sense. But there's no question that in 1968, in fact, I've actually wondered if the title of my book should be Born at the Right Time. I've actually wondered about that in the sense that that's not the only thing. There were other opportunities made available. And so much so that years later, when I'm a professor and a lot of great things have happened to me, I had folks say something to me that no one had ever said. They said, you are smart. And you know what? Enough people said that. I said, oh, it must be true. I'm smart. I called my mother and I said, Mama, folk tell me I'm smart. She said, I love you. I always loved you. I always wanted the best for you. You are not smart.
Oh, that was your mom.
What she said, I had an opportunity. I was given a chance. And at the end of the day, isn't that what folk want? Don't they want a chance?
Absolutely.
And in my case, some encouragement. Because when I came to UK in 1968, they could have easily discouraged me. It wouldn't have taken much at all, but instead they gave me the opposite of that. Do we do that for young people now?
Dr. Wright, would you argue if there's still systemic racism, there's still the vestiges of historical racism that's part of systemic racism today? So would you argue that the debt has not been paid and much more needs to be done to pay that debt and level the playing field for students of color?
Okay, here's what, first of all, I think, and this is not hardly original with me, the civil rights movement may have led to clearly two Black Americas, and that may be making it too simplistic. People like myself who, because of education and certain opportunities, have been able to move into the middle, if not upper class. And then other people, for whatever reasons, have not had those opportunities. The challenge, though, is also that there are many people who are not African American, poor whites, Mexican Americans, internationals who come to this country who also may be in the same category as African Americans. But there clearly are many African Americans still mired in a situation that, if anything, is worse than it was in 1968. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that we as a society, it is in our best interest to try to find some way of bringing about that change. What I think I've encountered for most of my adult life is that too many people believe that if you help this particular group, and it doesn't always have to be African Americans, but if you help them, it's somehow taking some opportunity or something away from them. You know, everywhere I've ever been, and granted, I was president of a historically Black college for 14 years, but other than that, I've been at predominantly white institutions. Nobody Black has denied anybody white from getting into any of those schools or advancing in those schools or anything. It's other white people who kept them out of getting whatever they have not gotten. Those schools have enough room for all of the Black people who wanted to go to those institutions or who wanted to be employed in those institutions. So, but nevertheless, there are many people who perceive as aiding Black people will somehow take something away from them.
So that gets right to a question in our Facebook comments from Rachel Bellin. She says, given your understanding of history, why does there invariably seem to be a backlash, some call it a white lash, to racial progress in America? And what conditions need to be in place to prevent it?
Okay. Well, it's a
it's at the power struggle you're talking about, in a way, right? The fear of losing something.
Here's what I was going to say. All right, the Civil War ends. Okay, the Civil War ends. Black people are now free. There are many white people, though, who are determined that slavery may have ended, but there will be a new racial order that still maintains whites at the top and Blacks at the bottom. And so there have always been some people, and again, I don't ever want to come across as painting all whites with one brush, but there has always been a segment of white America who has viewed any step for Blacks as somehow a threat to them. In so many instances, when a neighborhood, just to give one example, when one Black family moves into a neighborhood, may not be a problem, but there comes a number, and it's never 50%. It may not even be 25%, that it then becomes too Black, or in that regard. So prejudice has been there. How do you eradicate prejudices? For me, I've often said, on the one hand, education, but you know what I've actually believed? It's one-on-one, that when you meet people and you somehow are able to see the commonality in that regard, but you know, that can be a very slow process of bringing about changes. The law does make a difference. Martin Luther King said, the law can make you stop doing something. The law can't make you love me, but if you stop doing something that's illegal to me, that maybe over time your heart too will change in that regard. But I've actually thought that if you ever meet any group of people who you label as quote unquote others, why can't you notice that you probably share a lot in common with those, quote, other people. Their race, their religion, their gender, their sexual orientation may be the only thing you don't share in common with them, yet you use that to be the dominant aspect of the two of you.
Mm. So much, I think, going on there to unpack, and how we figure out how to get through this struggle today and actually see more progress on the other side. Dr. Wright, I saw on Twitter a response to maybe the conversation in Louisville right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the comment was about, for those who really want to work on racial equity and racial justice, we need to work on the issue of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to get to maybe the two Black Americas that you're talking about, in a way, after the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that person, that to really get to racial equity and racial justice, we need to work on poverty?
Okay. Well, interestingly that you would say that. If you had asked me, what do we need to do as far as education is concerned, or almost any issue, is how do you change the economic situation of people at the bottom of society? There are times when I am made aware of something that I just on the surface don't want to believe. My wife is a journalist, and so she reads everything and so forth. And so on one occasion, she saw a figure that said something to the effect that the average Black person has no more than $400 saved. And I said, no, that's an error somewhere. I said, no, that can't be correct. Well, just think about if a family or if an individual has no more than $400 and their car goes out, or the refrigerator, the washing machine, you fall and hurt yourself, your copay could be more than something like that. Well, you can imagine then what poverty must be like. And it's so all consuming. Again, you cannot focus on school. You cannot do anything. So how does one go about combating poverty? I don't know, but I do understand that poverty is at the root of so many of the issues that we face in our society. And that doesn't answer it. I guess it's just an acknowledgement that I do agree that poverty is at the root of things.
And education is part of our solution to reducing poverty and helping folks find their way to a better quality of life. So, as you've spent so many years in education in Kentucky and outside of Kentucky, as the former president of Prairie View A&M University in Texas, as you mentioned, an HBCU, what do we need to do to improve education? As you saw students coming into the university, you saw how they were supported in the university. What are we getting right?
Okay.
What do we really need to work on?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I realized is that if an individual, male, female, makes it to college, they've already overcome a certain hurdle. And I say this because when I was president of Prairie View has alums who live in not only Houston, Texas, and the large cities of Texas, but Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. And back then, I was president from 2003 to 2017. I would go to a place like Los Angeles, and they would say, if you take 100 young people in the 9th grade, only 25 of them are going to graduate. And you say, no, that can't be. And then you multiply that every year. That's LA, then you do Chicago, then you do all these other places. And you say, oh my goodness. So the problem is, how do you get young people starting in elementary school, definitely in junior high school, to see the value of an education? And a lot of that, and again, I don't want to blame the victim, and I don't want to blame someone's family. But in a lot of impoverished backgrounds, young people are being raised by a single parent, a single adult. And sometimes it's not their mother or their father. A lot of times it's a grandparent, and sometimes it's somebody who they say is an uncle or an aunt, and it's really no blood to that. To their credit, these people are willing to step up. But you can imagine the difficulty that people are encountering right now. Just think about with COVID, and so many young people are having to do their education virtual. Okay, suppose you have 3 children. You're a single parent. What about your job? Even if you're home, you need to be online doing your job, and then you have others. I tell folk that my wife and I, we were married, both colleges. We got married as undergraduates, but we didn't have a child till we had been married for 10 years. And I still can remember saying, honey, you need to do the homework. I got this other stuff to do. And so forth. There were 2 college educated adults with 1 child. And there were times when I said, this is too much. Then we have another child when I'm age 40, for heaven's sakes, and they've got me doing 3rd grade math. I can't do this stuff. Okay.
You're smart.
Well, right. Okay. Well, but so think about it. My son, when he's in elementary school, he has 2 adults who can help him. And it still was too much. On one occasion, I'm not exaggerating, he had to have 25 different wildflowers, and you had to drive within a 100-mile radius of Austin, Texas to get them. He had 2 adults and we had cars. What if we didn't have cars? What if he had 1 parent? How can we do that?
Yeah. Dr. Wright, that gets right to a point made by Breen Martin on Facebook. She says, I think many people enjoy thinking there are others below them. And initially the trend was to punish Blacks for their success by killing them and or destroying their businesses. Then it was to discredit their accomplishments. And now it seems to extend to discrediting the barriers, as though there are none, that prevent many other minorities from success. Mm-hmm. So I think you're getting to that in what you were just talking about, that if we don't really credit, I guess, the barriers for what they are, and understand better how to remove some of those barriers to help people continue to move forward, we're not alleviating any of these problems.
Yeah. I will tell you that as a college president of a historically Black college, one of the things I discovered was that just having access to an education is really difficult. For one thing, I don't care whatever amount of money I say, oh, it only costs $5,000 a semester to go to the University of Kentucky or Prairie View. That's still a lot of money for some folk. And then the books, the this, the that, and so forth. And so just the cost of college. And I really worry about people going into debt to go to college. And so often people will take out student loans, but guess what? If you don't make progress, you drop out of school, then all of a sudden your loan will start, you will have to repay that. You don't have a good job. You can't hardly do that. You can't go back to school until you pay that off. And so you can accumulate more debt. And so it's a real challenge for folk. And again, you didn't hear me say that's white America's fault or the man's fault or something like that. It's just some of the things that are there that make it difficult for people who are impoverished, trying to turn that around in society.
So it reminds me of a quote, access without support is not opportunity.
Well, again, I can't dispute that. I would say in addition to that, you have to have, I will never downplay the encouragement that I receive from people. And what that means is you're in a classroom setting, and I do this now for folk. You know, and I have my class discuss a book or something. I try to draw people out. You can tell some people are almost afraid. They're as scared in being in that environment as they would be in some other kinds of things. I try to encourage them. One of the things I do with young people, I constantly ask them, what is it you want to be? And I say, well, you know, you can do that. There are plenty of people who are from your background who've overcome all of these things. It's designed to help people have that self-confidence. And I think we all know what that is. I mean, if you're playing basketball and you're at the free throw line and you've missed 3 in a row and you're just saying, oh man, I can't make, you won't make it. You will miss that free throw. By contrast, if you go up there saying, I know I can do it, it's different. And the same is true with education.
So encouraging. Dr. Wright, we have a question from someone I know, familiar to you, President Aaron Thompson. He asks, knowing what we know about the history of inequities, what recommendations would you make for high schools and colleges to implement to close achievement and opportunity gaps?
Okay. This may be contradictory. I do understand the need for students to have made certain grades. I understand the need for students to make certain test scores and so forth. I wonder though, when we're trying to admit students, when we're trying to give them assistance, how do we really look at the total person, what she or he may have had to overcome? So clearly, in some instances, it may mean that a person is a C student rather than a B student, or something like that. How do you do that? And then, so our scholarship, you have to have some scholarships that are not always based on academic, but have to be need-based. But then, how does one maintain that? A lot of times I've seen students who are on a scholarship and once they're in college, they have to have a 3.0 or 2.75 or something like that. I wish at times it was just based on making progress from freshman to second semester freshman and so on down the line. That's what I think they have to do. Then what about the support groups that people need to have? If let's say again, being at the University of Kentucky, the age I am now, it's okay if I don't have a support group to talk to all the time or certain other kinds of things, but I'm not a 17 or 18-year-old freshman, a young woman in that sense. That how are we supporting folk? I hear people say a lot of times, I don't think when I was that age, I ever said, I don't see enough people who look like me. Well, I hear people saying that, and that's real to them. Do we have enough people who, quote, look like them in positions to where they can go to? I realize at the age I'm at now, you can get inspiration from anyone, but if you're a younger person, you might need to talk with someone who comes as close to being from the same kind of background as you're from. So I think those are things that that have to be in place to help young people.
That we've got another question here from a listener. Larry Holiday asks, what are the most significant changes you've witnessed in students' questions and comments in your classes over your career? In other words, how have student attitudes and student knowledge of history and slavery changed over the years?
Wow, that's a real good question. Well, I think students come in now, even if I can open up some aspects of topics, like for instance, I'm not so sure most students have read about free Black people during the slavery period, in the sense that there were some Blacks who were free while most blacks were slaves. That's not something they know about, but they seem to have a better understanding that black people were not willing to accept being slaves, or that they were content with being slaves, that I think they understood that there was something about people who wanted to find a way to rebel, that they did not accept excuse me, the status quo. And so I think I see that a lot even when I'm talking about slavery. I think when I'm talking about the period after slavery, let's say coming down to Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Nelson Mandela, I think they have a better understanding of those individuals than I had years ago with students, that these students come in now knowing more about those people. And granted, I just mentioned men, they also know of some women who were part of the movement better. I'm sorry, in the past. So I think they come in knowing that there has been a struggle more than just passivity on the part of Black people than years ago. And I think they understand also more the contradiction of our founding fathers. Even if they can't articulate it fully, they do understand that George Washington or Thomas Jefferson may have proclaimed freedom, but did they really extend freedom to everyone? So I think they do understand that a little bit better. So in that sense, while I'm not, I would definitely say it doesn't mean they're more knowledgeable overall, but I think their instincts, I think just living now, they may have been exposed to a little bit more of these things than was the case when I first started teaching.
Yeah, that's good news. So I want to shift gears a little bit, Dr. Wright, to your work today and the work that you have planned into the future. So much of your work in recent years seems to be grounded in comparison studies of race relations. And in the spring semester, you'll be teaching a class called Global Black Freedom Struggle, with special emphasis on the lives of Ida B. Wells, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela. What have you learned from studying the struggle for equality and justice that is universal and that is unique to the US? And what do we need to more deeply understand today if we are to be part of bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice?
I'll broaden it a little bit by saying that this semester I'm teaching a class that's called a comparative study of slavery in the Americas. And that means looking not just at slavery in what is British North America, but looking at slavery in the Caribbean, looking at slavery in South America, but above all, focusing on slavery in Brazil. Literally 45% of all the enslaved people arrived in Brazil. By contrast, no more than 5 to 10% of the people arrived in what becomes the United States. So at any rate, after slavery ends, 1865 the United States, 1880 in Brazil, at the same time, Africa is being colonized. A lot of us remember just from our schooling, essentially in 1875, the various European countries, they sit down and they carve up Africa. Belgium gets what was the Congo. Italy gets a piece, England gets many pieces, and so on down the line. And so this leads to a certain level of oppression that may have been called Jim Crow or racial discrimination in the United States, but something in Africa. And then if you look at places like Australia and other places, they too, the people of color are encountering these things. So in the second course, I literally use a lot of the research that I've done since the 1990s, beginning in the early 1990s. My wife and I started going abroad every summer. And so for 10 consecutive years, we went through concentration camps in Germany and in Eastern Europe, culminating in Poland. Then after that, we went to various places in in Asia for a period of years. And then we spent time in going to Australia, and we saved South Africa and Brazil for last. What you discover is that while the United States has always claimed to be first in freedom, the beacon of democracy, and so forth, some of these places have been ahead of them. Australia in 2008 issued an apology to the Aborigine people. Of course, there's been reconciliation hearings and things in South Africa to try to overturn some of the things that happened there. The United States has never issued an apology for slavery. Some other places have gone further than us. So the comparative thing gives you a sense of what has happened in other places and with the United States. And it's not to say in every instance the United States comes across as being the villain. That's not at all what I'm saying. But you try to understand what race relations has been like there. For one thing, in virtually all of those African countries and in the Caribbean, after World War II, the European countries opened their doors on a limited basis to those folk. And so some of the problems that folk had often associated only with the United States now exist all over Europe and so forth. And again, there are challenges in places like Brazil, where maybe 50% of the people are people of color in that regard. So at any rate, the comparative has given me, some additional way to look at race in the United States by sometimes looking at race outside of the United States. So that's one of the books that I'm trying to write. I might add that in 1948, a scholar by the name of Edward Franklin Frazier looked at race relations in the United States and race relations in Brazil. And so in a real sense, that's where I started, by looking at what E. Franklin Frazier did way back then. And I decided to look at that, but broaden it some.
Well, fascinating work. So if I could sit in on that class in the spring, I would. You let me know when you open source it and we'll share with everyone. But I want to bring it back home, Dr. Wright. So bring it back to Kentucky. You'll soon be working on your autobiography, Growing Up Black in Kentucky During the Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
What has kept you marching day after day all these years to keep the movement alive in big and small ways?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think my wife would tell you, and others who really know me, I am by nature a very optimistic person. I'm not a naive person. I am an optimistic person. I believe that I don't know when I read these things about hard work leads to success and so forth, but I'm not exaggerating. I mentioned earlier, I was not a good student in high school. My own fault, nobody else's fault. But in high school, I read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And in there, about halfway through the book, it mentions his 13 virtues by which a person should live by. Get up early, work hard, listen more than you talk, don't speak evil of others, imitate Socrates and Jesus, these type of things. I wrote those down, didn't have a typewriter back then. And throughout my college career, I would look at those almost on a weekly basis. And I really do believe in the gospel of hard work. Now, maybe that cuts against the grain of some other things. So I've always been optimistic. And I've always thought that if you are the person who can listen to other people and that other people see, I really believe, before I ever heard of the concept of someone is willing to give you a hand up, I believe that. I always thought that if somebody met me, they would like me. They would have to be cold-hearted to not like me. I mean, it just wouldn't make sense, because I make folks smile. I say, okay. I might say, darn, I don't like this, but if that's the way the rules are, or something like that, I would say something like, They won't give a brother a break. I just say that stuff just as part of a rap, but then I'm gonna go ahead and do it. So I am an optimist in that sense. But I also believe that, again, when I talk about coming along at the right time, here's what this also means. 1963, the March on Washington, or you think about all the things that happened in the civil rights movement, George Wright never attends a demonstration or something like that. I'm really too young to do those things. Now, granted, in certain places, I know there are folk in Birmingham where they had kids and so forth. But guess what? There were other people who were beaten up, who lost their jobs, who did all the sacrifices to open doors for someone like me. If the world had truly been fair in 1968, UK should have said, we want senior Black folk to come out here to this program and enroll and so forth. But instead, they were made opportunities for someone like myself. So what has kept me going is that I have a debt that I owe society to try to somehow give back. And in my case, not only do I want to make opportunities for young Black folk, but I discovered a long time ago that I know how to bring people who say they are, quote, different to the table and help them find something commonality. I don't think I'm putting people down by saying we share more in common than are different. I can do that with anybody. If you tell me you're gay, if you tell me you're Muslim, if you tell me you're a woman, you tell me whatever you are, I'm willing to acknowledge that difference, but I will then say, you and I share more in common than what divides us. And so I've always had the ability to have other people at the table. And so I have a responsibility to remind Black people that we've got to make sure we have opportunities for Mexican American people and others who might not have the voice in that. I'm gonna tell you, I don't mean to put a damper on this, but I'm gonna give you an example that really mattered to me. I mentioned earlier that I had two children. My daughter was born after my wife and I had been married 10 years, and my son was born after we had been married 40 years. My daughter at age 22 developed a kidney condition, and she then spends 2 years in the hospital, first in the Dallas area where I was provost at the University of Texas at Arlington. And the day that I then moved to assume the presidency of Prairie View, my wife and son have to go on ahead because by now my daughter spends almost all her time and she can no longer eat through the mouth. She has to be fed through a tube, and I have to disconnect the tube and take her there and drive. Well, at any rate, over those 2 years, we spend a lot of time at hospitals. And when I'm there, there would be times that I would get tired of just, being in the room, and I would walk around, and invariably I would end up down in the emergency area. That's chaotic in hospitals in places like Houston and Dallas. And I would see all these Mexican American, either citizens or national folk, and they can't speak English. And guess what? They don't know the president of the hospitals like I did. Nobody had given them free parking and food vouchers. And I said, my goodness, as bad as this is for me, it's worse for them. And so I decided that I've got to make sure there are opportunities for other folks. My daughter would, in fact, die from the illness. And that's part of another whole story. But the point is that I have a responsibility, not just to Black people to assist them, but anybody who needs that. And so that's what keeps me going, is that I tell the folk at UK all the time, I said, you know what, I have a hidden agenda. You're not supposed to say that, right? Everybody thinks you got a hidden agenda. So I tell them, folk, I have a hidden agenda.
You're on Facebook Live, so you're hidden.
I tell folk,
ready to be
I
public.
want them to have the same opportunities I had. That's all. So here it is. a guy of average ability who've been able to do the things I've done in life because of opportunity and hard work. So
And
that's
lift,
what I want.
lift as you climb, right? It sounds like lifting as you
That's what
climb.
you're supposed to do. You're supposed to encourage folk.
Mhm.
And I've probably said that a dozen times already, but that's what keeps me going. Along the way, I'm willing to admit, in a world that we're living now, there are some people who probably think I'm not angry enough, but you all don't see inside of me. But what is the point of me showing you my anger? In fact, last week in my class, when students were very upset and some of them spoke in a language that was rather coarse at times. And I said, you all don't want me to talk like that. You all want me to stay at a certain level. For one thing, if I started talking like that, then I'd have to come back next week and apologize to everybody. And I said, but why can't you believe I am as sincere as you are? But somebody has got to make sure he or she maintains the course and keeps saying, this is how we go ahead. And I hope it doesn't sound like a cliche, but during the civil rights movement, people used to say, keep your eye on the prize. What's the real goal here? In that regard. And that's what I say to young people all the time. The anger won't get it. How are you going to make the changes that you need to be successful?
Dr. Wright, this has been a real pleasure for me to have this conversation with you this evening, and I know it's been a real treat for all those who have been listening in to hear your thoughts and your history and your perspective. You shared with me in our conversation a week or so ago that at Prairie View and maybe other universities as well, you've shared a reading list.
That's right.
And you have 2 of those reading lists that you share with folks. And I have copies of those that you've graciously sent me, and we will make sure those are either posted in our Facebook comments for folks or on our annual meeting webpage, and get that out, because I know we've had questions tonight about reading material as well.
Yes.
And I am imagining and know that there's plenty of encouragement in that reading list, hearing you share your focus tonight.
Yeah.
So I just want to, again, thank you so much for taking time tonight. Thank you for coming back to Kentucky and for everything that you're doing at the University of Kentucky for our young people, for the next generation, and for post-secondary progress, and for being a voice of optimism and a voice of understanding.
Well, thank you so much, and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye. Okay.
Kenya, thank you.